Bună seara, sunt Andreea Sava și urmăriți Descoperiți. Mai sunt doar câteva ore până la deschiderea urnelor în România, fiindcă în diaspora s-a votat și astăzi și deja este scandal uriaș, fiindcă peste 10.000 de voturi prin corespondență, poate chiar peste 20.000, au fost pur și simplu pierdute. Poate unii ați sperat că după valul de controverse de la alegerile locale din septembrie s-au luat măsuri pentru siguranța votului. Ei bine, veți vedea că s-au luat măsuri, însă vă arăt în exclusivitate cum unele dintre acestea ridică și mai multe suspiciuni și practic fac fraudarea și mai simplă decât până acum. Începem însă cu un alt subiect extrem de important, și anume vaccinarea anticovid, fiindcă președintele României a anunțat deja aprobarea în CSAT a Strategiei Naționale de Vaccinare, doar că foarte multe dintre controversele legate de aceste noi vaccinuri au rămas total nelămurite. Și am căutat răspunsuri la unul dintre cei mai respectați experți ai planetei în acest domeniu, respectiv directorul general al Institutului Internațional pentru Vaccinuri, aflat în Coreea de Sud, un doctor fost colonel al Armatei Statelor Unite, unde a studiat timp de peste 20 de ani vaccinuri și tratamente cu material genetic, ADN și ARN. Îl veți vedea într-un interviu în exclusivitate în România pe care mi l-a acordat și de asemenea veți observa că răspunsurile doctorului Kim nu sunt deloc simple, nici despre efectele pe termen lung ale acestor vaccinuri, dar nici când l-am întrebat, atenție, dacă dumnealui se va vaccina. Veți auzi de asemenea cum demolează practic la propriu una dintre cele mai vehiculate teorii ale guvernanților români privind gestionarea pandemiei. Iată. Hello again, Dr. Kim, and thank you for agreeing to speak again with the Romanian public. We are now at a stage that several pharma companies announced more than one vaccine, and some of them stated that they will soon begin the procedures for, authorization of this vaccine in Europe, in USA, and so on. But we've also seen studies, and I've seen you at the CNBC a few days ago mentioning this, that there are some people that believe in vaccination, so we're not talking about the anti-vaccination movement, that have expressed concerns that maybe the rush to make a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine may have jeopardized, the safety. What do you think about these concerns? Are they rightful? What would you say to these people?
Yes, so I think, the announcement last week and this week of high levels of protection against SARS-CoV-2 disease and roughly 2 months worth of safety data is actually very important. I mean, it's critically important because it's an important proof of concept that we can make a vaccine that protects against COVID-19, but it's also an important proof of concept for RNA vaccines, which are a new class of vaccines that we've never really used before or never had approval of before. It's important to recognize that what we have now is 2 months worth of data on protection against disease and roughly 2 months worth of data on safety. In the end, to be finally approved and licensed, it's likely that the regulatory agencies will require a longer duration of follow-up to ensure that this level of efficacy continues and that no additional problems develop. But what may be allowed is something called emergency use. And what the FDA is saying is, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, is that the vaccine is interesting. It's got very important properties. It appears to be safe and it appears to be protecting against infection, but we're not quite ready yet to fully give it, a license. And that's an important statement. It means that we do, in fact, really need to collect additional evidence of safety and efficacy. And on the one hand, on the other hand, we do know that there are high-risk groups, people who work around, who work in hospitals, the elderly. And it may be important to look at the balance of risk. In general, the Food and Drug Administration and the EMA are going to be looking at data roughly 2 months worth of safety data. And this is actually an important number. We know that when you give a vaccine, you see a lot of side effects in the beginning, in the first few days, maybe up to the first 2 weeks. You usually see the most, you see the bulk, the vast majority of complications within the first two months. So that's why the FDA chose, 2 months as the period of time before it would consider granting emergency use. So, do we need to follow volunteers for a longer period of time, for a year, 2 years, or 3 years? Yes, absolutely. Because there are sometimes things with vaccines that are uncommon, unexpected. So one of the potential complications, occurs with certain types of influenza vaccines associated with a neurological condition known as Guillain-Barré. So again, we do owe it to the volunteers to continue to follow them and to really ensure that these vaccines are safe over the long term.
So what are you saying that nobody can guarantee that some side effects won't appear on the long term? I mean, in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years.
Exactly. But that over the short term, over the period of time that the vaccine has been studied, so far there have been no signs of serious side effects. And given the burden of COVID-19 infection, the fact that it is 5 to 10 times more likely to kill someone than influenza, and given the tremendous burden of infections and disease around the world, it isn't surprising that the US FDA would allow emergency use under the circumstances that it's looked at the data and it feels comfortable that the data are as the company says they are.
Would you vaccinate yourself?
So I am not a person at particularly high risk. I live in the Republic of Korea, which has 300 infections in a population of 50 million per day. So again, it depends. Would I vaccinate someone who was, in the United States in a very high risk transmission setting? I would probably recommend that they should consider it. As we get more information on vaccines, and I think this is a critical, and you really hit the nail on the head. We really want to be able to assure people who are receiving vaccines that these vaccines are safe and effective. And it is a critical thing that we tell people, that we tell patients, as we're giving them vaccines, that they can be assured that these vaccines work and are not going to hurt them. Remember, we give vaccines to people who are healthy. We want them to stay healthy. We want the vaccines to protect them. So having, a process for emergency use is a very extraordinary circumstance. But COVID-19 has proven to be a very difficult problem for countries to control in the absence of vaccination. I think the other important point is, remember that a vaccine is not the immediate solution. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't make, just waving a vaccine will not make the disease go away. We are going to have to make a huge amount of these vaccines, maybe 16 billion doses. We're going to have to distribute it around the world. We're going to have to give it to the people who need to be vaccinated. And those two things are going to be a huge task ahead of us. And it's going to be a few years before we're going to be able to say, take off the masks. We're going to have to use the vaccine in combination with current methods of prevention, including masks, continued use of distance, and hygiene.
I want to get back a little about on the RNA and DNA technology vaccines, these new era vaccines, as they were called, because here there were expressed some concerns that maybe these vaccines, because they use genetic material, there's a theory that these vaccines would interfere with our genome. There's a possibility to integrate with our genome. I know you at International Vaccines Institute are studying this method with DNA and RNA. So what can you tell me about these vaccines?
No, that's a really great question, and it's one that the Food and Drug Administration and other regulatory agencies have worked on for as long as we've had these DNA vaccines and now RNA vaccines. I've been working doing testing of DNA vaccines in humans now for over 20 years. So the problem of integration is not really a significant one. We already know and are pretty confident that integration does not occur with the DNA vaccines. With the RNA vaccines, it's even less likely, because RNA would have to be made to go backward. So typically in a human body, the DNA and our genetic information is turned into RNA, which takes a message to our body's cells to make proteins. The process of going backwards from RNA to DNA does not happen in human bodies. It happens with certain classes of virus, like HIV, but in general, RNA can't convert itself into DNA and then integrate itself into the human body. So the RNA vaccines, again, the reason that they were allowed to proceed so rapidly is that they have information on RNA as a platform. RNA has been used as a vaccine for cancers and other infections, and so there was a database of safety on these vaccines, which made regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration or the EMA or the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea much more comfortable that these would not pose a long-term safety problem.
When I asked you, I want to get back to the Korean experience, because when I asked you if you will vaccinate yourself, you said, well, I'm not in a risk category and I live in a safe country. South Korea now, it has a total population over 51 million people, and I want to say this data for the Romanian public. You've never had more than a little over 1,000 cases a day. That was the peak I've seen. Never more than 10, I think 8 deaths a day, and at this point you have almost 500 deaths in total. So for comparison, Romania, my country, barely has 21 million people, the total population. At this point, we have days with more than 10,000 new cases a day, and our authorities don't test that much. So this is not the reason, the massive testing. And we've had days with over 200 deaths a day. So with your Korean experience, what would you say, what would you think would be the key to this success? I don't know, the most important thing, wearing a mask, testing and tracing and isolating, lockdown measures?
You know, I think it's a combination, unfortunately, of all of them together. It starts with the government having a clear set of messages and being very clear about the actions it's going to take, and then putting actions behind those words, handing out masks, making sure that hospitals, doctors, and nurses have protective equipment, making sure that people wear masks when they go out in public, making sure that the government itself understands where the high-risk transmission settings are and either closes them down or puts into place rules and regulations that will allow them to function and not be sources of transmission. The second part is around what the Koreans call testing, tracking, isolating, and treating. And when you look around Europe, actually several of the countries over the summer had instituted fairly good tracing systems and put into place significant testing. But it's also important to remember that when a person has a COVID-19 infection and they're supposed to be isolated, they should be isolated. That it's the people who are sick and infected who are spreading the disease, and unless they can be confined, then there's a risk that they may spread the disease to others. Now, the power of masks to prevent spread of the disease from a person who's infected to others, I think is a very important point that we may have missed in the beginning part of the pandemic. WHO didn't come out with definitive guidelines until June around most people wearing masks. In part, it was because they were afraid that masks were in short supply, and we really needed to have masks for healthcare workers. And the same thing, when you asked me about would I take a vaccine, and I said, well, Korea right at this point is pretty low risk. It's not because I wouldn't take a vaccine, but there are people who are at much higher risk than I am. And, we, at this point, because vaccine is in short supply or will be in short supply, we have to be able to prioritize. And the people who need to be protected should get the vaccine first.
When we last spoke, you told me about the Korean model. You told me that you've never locked down completely your economy, and that when you had a cluster, immediately the government made, if I'm remembering right, 85,000 tests for that cluster in the club in Seoul, and you found all 465 infected persons. You found even those who didn't develop symptoms, right?
Yes, I think one of the good things about doing a lot of testing is that you actually do find a lot of the asymptomatic infections. And that's really important because it's unfortunately the people who are sick, who don't show any symptoms, and think that they're well and are going out and going to meetings, going out to eat, going to bars, going to church, who are inadvertently spreading the infection.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Kim, and hope to hear us and talk again after we have a vaccine. Have a nice day.
Thank you.